The Pacific War was nearing its breaking point. Across the islands of the Pacific, thousands of weary Japanese soldiers were captured and marched behind barbed wire. Raised to believe surrender was worse than death, they braced for cruelty. Every step into captivity felt like stepping toward humiliation, starvation, and the slow erasure of honor. But when the doors of the camp swung open, they did not find chains or fists. Instead, long tables stood waiting, heavy with food, loaves of bread, slabs of butter, steaming stew, and metal urns of coffee. The prisoners halted, trembling. Nothing in their training had prepared them for this sight. Could abundance itself be a weapon? That first meal would change everything. The camp sat under a relentless sun, its barracks built from rough timber, encircled by coils of barbed wire that glinted in the salt, heavy Pacific breeze. The air carried the buzz of insects, the distant cries of seabirds, and the quiet shuffle of boots on dry earth. Inside marched the Japanese prisoners, thin, weary, their eyes hollow from both hunger and the crushing weight of shame. For them, surrender was a sin drilled into bone, a disgrace heavier than shackles. They braced for the cruelty they believed awaited them, yet the Americans they encountered stood calm, rifles steady, but without malice. The grounds were clean, the order precise, the atmosphere unsettlingly humane. And within those fences, around wooden tables stacked with food, a cultural battle was about to begin. The line of prisoners moved in silence, their heads bowed, shoulders hunched beneath the Pacific sun. Dust clung to their uniforms, sweat streaked down hollow faces, and every step into the camp felt like a step deeper into the unknown. Their minds replayed the images drilled into them by military propaganda. Americans as beasts, men who gouged eyes, burned flesh, and laughed over the suffering of captives. Among them shuffled Private Hiroshi Tanaka, 23 years old, a farmer's son from the rice fields of Kyushu. Just months earlier, he had tended green shoots under spring rain, never imagining that war would wrench him halfway across the ocean. Now trembling, he feared starvation. In whispered Japanese, he told the man beside him, "They will torture us. We will never see home again." Others nodded, their whispers rippling down the column like wind through reeds. To surrender was worse than death. Back home, their families would be told they died honorably, not that they lived dishonored behind barbed wire. The weight of that shame pressed heavier than their fatigue, yet when they lifted their eyes, what they saw unsettled them in a different way. The American guards, sunburned, helmets tilted, rifles resting at ease, watched with an air of routine, not malice. One barked orders in clipped English, and the column adjusted. But there was no whip, no kick, no mocking laughter. At the gate stood Sergeant William Miller, a stocky Midwesterner with a square jaw and a soldier's composure. His tone was firm but unheated. "Keep them moving. Discipline, nothing else," he told his men. To Miller, this was procedure. To the prisoners, his calm was confusing. Too measured, too professional for the demons they had been warned about. Inside, they were assigned to barracks, rows of wooden huts, orderly and bare. The smell of sawdust and the faint salt of the sea filled the air. Tanaka sat on his bunk, fingers clenched, his stomach aching with hunger. His heart braced for cruelty. In those first hours, the men expected humiliation to come crashing down at any moment. But the silence stretched on, the cruelty did not come, and the tension only grew heavier. Something was wrong. Something was different. When the whistle blew, the prisoners were marched toward a long wooden hall. The heavy doors creaked open, and at once a wave of smell hit them, rich, heavy, unfamiliar. Inside, long rows of tables stretched from wall to wall, each groaning under the weight of food. There was golden cornbread cut in thick squares, steaming bowls of potatoes drenched in butter, dark stew that smelled of beef and onions, and massive metal urns hissing with hot coffee. The Japanese prisoners froze. Their eyes darted from the food to the guards, half expecting it to vanish like a cruel trick. Whispers spread down the line in hushed Japanese. "It must be poisoned. They are mocking us. This cannot be real." Private Hiroshi Tanaka's stomach tightened. He remembered home, how rice had been rationed to fist-sized portions, how his mother had watered down soup until it tasted of nothing, how children in his village grew thin while the army took what remained. He stared at the slabs of butter melting into bread, and shame mixed with hunger, until his hands trembled. At the front of the room, An American in a white apron wiped his hands on a cloth and smirked. Corporal James O'Connor, the camp's cook, was an Irish-American from Chicago. He nudged a fellow guard and muttered under his breath, "These boys look like they've never seen a steak before." The guard chuckled, shaking his head. To them, this was just dinner duty. The prisoners were herded to the tables. Metal trays clattered as they were pushed forward, the sound sharp against the tense silence. Hiroshi's hands hovered above the food, but he did not move. The smell of butter was almost overwhelming, its richness so alien it felt dangerous. One by one, men began to taste, a spoonful of stew, a bite of bread. The hall filled with the sound of cutlery scraping plates, cautious chewing, quiet swallowing. Hiroshi finally lifted a tin cup of coffee. He sipped. The bitterness hit him like a slap and he nearly choked. But then came the warmth, spreading down his throat, filling his chest. It was strong, foreign, but alive. The room was silent except for the sounds of eating. Men glanced at each other, confusion etched into every face. The cruelty they expected had not come. In its place was something more bewildering, abundance. Hiroshi sat frozen, cup in hand, his mind spinning. What kind of enemy fed prisoners like this? The first meal did not end with relief. It ended with questions. As the prisoners ate in silence, their senses drank in details they could not ignore. The bread was soft, yeasty and heavy on the tongue, nothing like the light rice that had been their staple. The stew was rich, oily, with chunks of meat that felt almost obscene in their abundance. And the coffee, bitter and black, seemed to thrum in their veins long after the last sip. For men raised on rice, miso and fish, the contrast was overwhelming. This was not sustenance. This was excess. Hiroshi whispered to the man beside him, his voice trembling. "How can they waste this much? Back home, my children starve." His words hung in the air, bitter as the coffee itself. At another table sat Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura, a proud officer in his late 30s. His uniform was torn, his body gaunt, but his posture remained straight, his jaw set. He did not touch the food. His pride would not allow it. To eat the enemy's bread felt like swallowing defeat. His men glanced at him nervously, waiting for a signal. They chewed slowly, ashamed, as if caught in a betrayal. The Americans noticed the hesitation. One guard, a young man with freckles, slid an extra piece of bread across to Nakamura without a word. Another shrugged, muttering in English, "Plenty more where that came from." To them, food was endless, a resource as steady as the ocean breeze outside. Nakamura stared at the bread. His hands trembled, his face pale. The smell of butter wafted upward, rich and heavy. Hunger clawed at him. He resisted, lips pressed tight, until finally, with deliberate slowness, he lifted the bread and took a single bite. His men watched in stunned silence as their officer chewed. Then, almost in unison, they followed, relief softening the tension in their faces. The cultural shock deepened with every moment. The Americans ate noisily, with metal forks and knives clattering against trays. They laughed loudly, spoke casually across the room, slapped one another on the back. For the Japanese prisoners, accustomed to quiet meals, bowls lifted close to their mouths, chopsticks poised in silence, it was a scene of chaos. The sensory overload was impossible to ignore. The clatter of cutlery echoed like hammer strikes. The smell of sugar drifted from the dessert table, where pale cakes were stacked in careless squares. Outside, flies buzzed in the humid air, the drone blending with the rattle of trays and the steady hum of voices. A soft Pacific breeze pushed through the cracks in the wooden hall, carrying with it the salt of the ocean. Hiroshi sat in the midst of it all, overwhelmed. His mind drifted to the village fields of Kyushu, where every grain of rice was measured, where his mother scolded him if he left even a single kernel uneaten in his bowl. Here food was piled high, portions larger than families could dream of. He swallowed hard, whispering inwardly, "They treat food like air, endless. We treat it like life itself." The men looked at one another, some trembling, some in awe. They could not understand. Was this mercy? A strategy to weaken their resolve? A cruel illusion? A soft trap before some hidden torment? The questions gnawed at them even as their stomachs filled. Pride wrestled with hunger. Fear wrestled with gratitude. For the first time since their capture, the prisoners felt not brutality, but bewilderment. And as they rose from the tables, carrying the taste of butter and coffee on their tongues, one thought lingered among them all. If this is kindness, why does it feel like another weapon? When the mess hall emptied and the trays were cleared, silence returned to the barracks. But it was not a restful silence. The men lay awake on their bunks, their stomachs full yet their minds restless. Gratitude and suspicion twisted together like barbed wire. Some whispered thanks for a day without hunger. Others whispered warnings, do not be fooled. This is a trap. For men raised on the conviction that the enemy was inhuman, the simplest act of feeding them felt like a puzzle designed to break their will. Private Hiroshi Tanaka lay staring at the ceiling beams, his hands clasped over his chest. He could still taste the bitterness of coffee, still smell the butter melting on bread. The relief of survival pressed against the shame of eating food offered by an enemy. They feed me, he thought bitterly, yet in doing so they remind me of my dishonor. Across the room, Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura sat upright, his officer's pride unbroken but shaken. His voice was low, steady as he addressed the younger men. Do not forget who we are. This is not kindness, it is war by another method. They want to soften our spirit with food. His words carried weight. For him, the bread was not nourishment. It was psychological warfare. Meanwhile, on the American side, the motives were far less complicated. In the kitchen, Corporal James O'Connor stacked pots with a shrug. Feed 'em well and they don't cause trouble. Simple as that. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the rafters, indifferent to the prisoners' turmoil. Sergeant William Miller echoed the same pragmatism as he checked the camp's perimeter. War isn't personal. Orders are clear. Treat them humanely and keep the peace. His words were not sentimental, not meant as mercy, only discipline and procedure, and there lay the contrast. For the Americans, food was efficiency. For the Japanese prisoners, food was shocking mercy, almost unbearable in its generosity. The moral question hung unspoken. Was kindness a tactic, or was it a fleeting glimpse of shared humanity in a world tearing itself apart? As the sun bled red over the horizon, Hiroshi sat alone by the barbed wire fence. In his hands, he held a small piece of leftover bread, its crust hardened by the evening air. He stared out at the ocean, waves breaking in the distance, his face unreadable. The narrator's voice lingers. In a war defined by brutality, even bread became both a weapon and a mercy. For these men, the enemy's feast was not just food. It was a haunting question. If they could feed us like brothers, why did we kill each other like beasts?